Welcome to the trauma series presented by the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. This is part one, Understanding Trauma and Its Effects. My name is Dr. Alicia Summers. I'm the Director of Research and Evaluation at the National Council. And along with my colleague, Dr. Sean Marsh, the Chief Program Officer of Juvenile Law, we're going to be presenting this three-part trauma series. The first part is going to be on understanding trauma and its effects. What we hope to accomplish with this short video is an understanding of what trauma is, an understanding of the effects of trauma on children and adolescents, and increased awareness of adverse childhood experiences. Part two of our trauma series is going to focus on creating conditions of healing, and part three is going to focus on the trauma responsive court, so applying what you've learned in the first two to create court conditions. We like to start with the beginning. Trauma is so important to consider in context of individuals that we work with in the court system, and this could be parents or youth, but in particular, youth are very vulnerable to trauma and its effects, and that's because the infant and adolescent brain are still developing. If you think about all the literature that we know from the Human Development Series says that infant brain development really sets the stage for all future learning. And infancy is when babies start interacting with others in their environment, and these interactions form the foundations of brain architecture. This helps create all the neural connections between the different areas of the brain and helps build emotional and cognitive skills. For example, an infant will coo or make noise, and a parent or caregiver will respond to them. It's through this type of interaction that they start making those connections, social connections, emotional connections. It's also through these types of interactions that the infant will start to develop skills like learning. The parent or caregiver will show the infant pictures in a book. They'll say the words associated with those pictures. And later on, the infants will start recognizing those pictures and then the words associating with them, and that'll help them to learn how to read. So this is really a critical time for infants. They have to start mapping these connections. If they don't have those interactions, then their brain can't develop in a healthy, normal way that it was meant to. And there's several studies where we've seen the profound effects that this lack of interaction has on infants and youth. Think about what it would be like if they don't get those things that they need, if they don't have the interaction that's required to help build this foundation.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still phase experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby who's about a year of age. And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her. This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this. And then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions. They turn away, they feel the stress of it, they actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing. It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
So this video makes a couple really good points. You're looking at an infant who has normal, healthy development and interactions with caregivers. They spend 2 minutes. Think about that for a minute. 2 minutes is all it takes for this young child to get stressed out because they're not getting the appropriate levels of interaction, the levels of interaction that they're used to. And this, again, is the healthy, normal child. When we start looking at the children and families that we serve that come before the court system, there's likely to be a host of other things going on in their environment that could affect whether they're getting the level of interaction that they need to appropriately map the brain connections for future foundations of learning. They may not be getting the interaction. They also might have other things going on that create this level of stress. But it is important to think about this particular example is just a few minutes of stress. And stress does not equal trauma. There's good stress in your life. Weddings are typically good stress. Buying a new house, getting a promotion at work, all of those can be stressful things, but we typically think of them as good stress, and we wouldn't necessarily count them as trauma. Stress is also tolerable. Getting stuck in traffic on the way to work may not be fun, could be considered stressful, but it's not necessarily a trauma. So we don't want to say stress and trauma are the same thing. However, when you've hit your limit of stress, this is when it gets closer to being trauma. This is what we call toxic stress. Toxic stress is an excessive, prolonged activation of a stress response. So if the infant was never getting that reaction from the mother and is in a constant state of stress, that would be on the realm of toxic stress. We also think about traumatic stress. Traumatic stress is when you've been exposed to a traumatic event that overwhelms your capacity to cope. Now, toxic stress and traumatic stress are a little bit different, but we're probably going to use the terms interchangeably for the purpose of this presentation. Both of these are when you have an overwhelming, something overwhelms your capacity to deal with the current levels of stress, and you have a very high stress response that continues. So what is trauma, or these stress responses? What does it actually do to you? What it really does is it leads to a robust fight or flight response. When you experience trauma, and trauma can be defined broadly, but trauma is when you have a strong negative emotional response to a series of events outside your control. So that could be someone threatening to kill you, someone injuring you, someone you witnessing someone else who is having a physical injury or threat of death, and you experience strong feelings of terror or helplessness or fear. So when you have that trauma, it activates a fight or flight response. This is just evolutionary perspective here. We used to have to face off predators, and when you have predators, your body has to respond in a certain way. And what it does is it shuts down everything that you don't need to send all the resources and to divert energy so that you can either fight whatever it is you need to or run from whatever it is you need to. And they're going to give you a little bit more technical terms related to that in this video.
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious, lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
So traumatic stress and toxic stress can lead to an overwhelming of the system. Like I said, all the resources are diverted to these energies, and it makes it hard for children and adolescents to develop, grow, and learn at the rate that they're supposed to. And while for the standard population that may not have to deal with these things on a day-to-day basis, they only have potential trauma occasionally. Most of the children and families that come before the court system, the child abuse and neglect court system, delinquency court system, or even in our family violence court systems, a lot of those families have extra circumstances where they deal with more types of stress and more traumas on a day-to-day basis. One way that we know this, and we know the detrimental effects of this throughout the life course, in addition to some of these studies that identify how the brain's different, is through the research on the adverse childhood experiences. There's a study that began in the 90s called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. We call it the ACEs study for short reference. And what they did was they asked a group of people who were coming in for a screening check, thousands of people for a medical screening, 10 questions. And they were 10 yes or no questions related to whether or not they'd experienced specific things under the age of 18 by a household member. And those were related to physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical and emotional neglect, or whether there were different types of household dysfunction, such as domestic violence in the home, mental illness, incarceration of a household member, substance abuse in the home, or divorce or separation of parents. They asked individuals and the yes or no's on this, and then they counted them up to determine how many their ACEs score actually was. And your ACEs score can range from 0 no's to all of these up to 10 yeses to everything on the list. What they found when they looked at it is about a third of the population in their sample had a 0 ACEs score. They'd not experienced any of the adversity listed. And the other 2/3 had at least 1 or more. 16% had an ACE score of 4 or more. Now, this is for the general population. If you think about the population that we serve, children and families involved in the court system or child abuse and neglect court system, most of those, if they're involved in child abuse and neglect, are going to have at least one, if not multiple ones of those. And there's been some research on our juvenile delinquency population that illustrates that they're way more likely to have 4 or more of these, but 90% had had at least 1 on the ACEs score. Over 50% had had ACEs scores of 4 or more. So they're much more likely to have experienced some type of adversity in childhood than the general population as a whole, which makes our population even more vulnerable that we work with, because the research shows there's a relationship between having 4 or more of these ACEs and a host of negative outcomes throughout life. These youth are anybody who's had 4 or more of the ACEs before age 18 are twice as likely to smoke, 7 times more likely to be alcoholics, 6 times more likely to have had sex before the age of 15. That's also related to a host of other risky sexual behavior that goes beyond the average adolescent risk-taking behaviors, including more likely to have teen pregnancies, more likely to have STDs, and a host of sexual partners. They're also twice as likely to have been diagnosed with cancer, 10 times more likely to have injected street drugs, and 12 times likely to have attempted suicide. So what we know from the study on the ACEs is this adversity in childhood is somehow related to risky behaviors in adolescence, to engaging in behaviors such as smoking or drinking or attempting suicide. So it's related to some of these mental health issues, and then ultimately to early death. They followed these people that they'd asked these questions for years. In fact, the study's still ongoing. And what they've learned is there's much more likely to die before the others who haven't experienced 4 or more of these. And part of it is because of some of these risky behaviors that they engage in, but it also increases the risk of negative health problems throughout life. So we know that this toxic stress and adversity in childhood is related to negative health problems. We also know from all of our research that there's not a typical response when children are exposed to trauma. So we know that you can't bring someone into court and look at them and say, oh, clearly they've been exposed to trauma because they're acting in this way. We know that that's not the case. We also know that the response people have to trauma varies across the lifespan. So infants are going to respond differently than adolescents. It's going to vary based on how old they are, but also on their gender. And we know that risk and resilience have a huge impact on traumatic responses. So of these individuals who had adversity in childhood, they might have been abused or neglected and not show any symptoms in adulthood. They may not smoke, they may not drink, they may not be at risk for early death because of resilience factors. And one of the things that we're going to focus on in videos 2 and 3 is how we promote resilience with the populations that we serve. It's a critical role, and we know that there are factors that work as protective factors for our families who have toxic stress, who experience trauma, no matter how ongoing it is. As I said, we know that it affects everyone a little differently. This is a chart that's put together with a very specific population in mind, focusing on children who are exposed to domestic violence across the lifespan. This is just a review of some of the literature that says how this might manifest in the children that we serve and within our courts. And there's dimensions of how it's expressed. So there's behavioral ways that there's expressed this exposure to trauma, social, emotional, and cognitive ways. So it can affect infants all the way up through adolescence in a host of different ways. Infants, it might look a little different. They're going to have trouble sleeping. They don't have their attachment needs met, but really they don't understand what's going on. And so cognitively, it's an inability to understand. But later in life, when they start getting older, that turns into self-blame. They might become distracted or inattentive and start having trouble at school, or get even very defensive and have a short attention span all the way up through adolescence. You can see if you look at this list that the behaviors are going to increase. There might be more aggression, behavior problems, trouble sleeping. And then in adolescence, here you see an increase in the risk of dating violence, delinquent behaviors, truancy, running away from the home. They're more at risk for these risky sexual behaviors, and also more likely to start abusing substances, have depression, and suicidal ideation. So there's a lot of different ways that people can respond to trauma, and it really does depend. It's important to think about all these different responses in context, and also to remember that the youth and families that come before the court might not be presenting any of these and actually have experienced trauma, or they might be acting out and having behavior problems not because they've well, let's just say they might be experiencing these behavior problems because of the traumatic experiences they had early on in life, things that we don't know. So it's important to take all these into consideration when you're thinking the best holistic way to treat these families. And that's what we're going to focus on in part 2. If you'd like additional information about the ACEs study, they have a website that lists all the different studies that have been done around this. Most of our information has also been retrieved from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, who's been our partner in working with trauma in the courts. And then our website, the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, also includes various information related to trauma and additional resources.